Welcome back to my video series about how to build a sub 250 gram 3-inch freestyle drone for absolute beginners who have never built a drone before. This is a video series, so if this is the video you were looking for, then great. But if you just stumbled across this video, then feel free to watch it. But if it feels like you're coming in the middle, that's why. There is a playlist linked in the video description below that has all the videos in this series. And if you're not sure what the heck's going on here, then you should go back to video number 1 and hopefully it'll all make sense. A whole bunch of the content in the video that you're about to watch is borrowed from my previous build series where I built a 5-inch drone. I just couldn't bear to re-record hours and hours of content that was going to be exactly the same, except instead of me holding a 5-inch drone in my hand, I'd be holding a 3-inch drone. I'm going back through these videos, and anytime there is a content that is unique to the 3-inch drone that you're building right now, I'm going to record that and I'm going to edit it in. But if there's a whole bunch of this video where I'm talking and I'm holding a 5-inch drone instead of a 3-inch, don't let it confuse you. It still applies to what you're doing. In this video, we are going to be installing the Walksnail video transmitter. And the one that came with your kit, and if somehow you've assembled the contents of the kit yourself, you're going to want to make sure you get the right one. This is the Walksnail Avatar HD Pro kit, and it is the little thinner one with a single antenna. That's the one we're working with. You could probably make another one work, but you might not be under 250 grams, and the 3D prints might not work if you somehow have stumbled across the dual antenna version. But that's what we're working with. And the first thing we need to do is figure out how to wire this up to the flight controller. And if we look closely at the video transmitter, I want you to see that there is a VCC, ground, RX, and TX. And there's also one here, ground, VCC, RX, and TX. So there's a plug, and then there also are solder pads for those who prefer to direct solder. We're going to be using the plug, so we're going to save ourselves that trouble. And I'm always a big fan of learning to interpret the wiring diagram from the labels on the device instead of having to look up the manual. Somewhere there's a card that has wiring instructions. Here it is. There's a card that has wiring instructions, and that's nice, but if we understand what the wires mean, we can figure it out without looking at the card. Nevertheless, here's the card. Let's take a closer look. And the first wire is VCC. That is the power input. VCC is a common term for power input. Why? Don't worry about it. Just that's what VCC means. And it needs 6 volts to 25.2 volts. It's very important whenever you wire up any accessory that you give it the voltage range that it expects. We're going to be powering this off. I think it's a 9 volt or a 10 volt regulator on the flight controller. So it's going to be getting 10 volts, and that is within the range of 6 volts to 25.2 volts. So we're good to go there. Then we've got the ground wire. And then we've got the TX and the RX, or the RX and the TX, and that's going to connect to the flight controller, TX and RX. And the thing to keep in mind is that the RX wire on the peripheral connects to the TX on the flight controller and vice versa. The analogy I like to use is that I throw the ball, you catch the ball. I TX transmit, you RX receive. So TX goes to RX and vice versa. And anytime you're wiring up a peripheral, whether you've got a wiring diagram or not, if you see VCC, ground, RX, and TX, then you kind of know how to wire it up. The only thing I would want to make sure is what voltage is that VCC rated for. I wouldn't want to make assumptions about that and accidentally fry it. The second piece of the puzzle is going to be where on the flight controller am I going to put these wires? And I went to the flight controller's product page to try to look for a manual, and here we have a pad layout and wiring diagram for the top of the flight controller, and here we've got the pad layout and the wiring diagram for the bottom, which includes the plugs on the underside. And one of the things about most modern flight controllers is that they have a plug for digital video transmitters like Walksnail, DJI, etc. So this could just plug in, but it's not. And the reason it's not is that Walksnail gives us this plug right here, and that plugs into the Walksnail VTX, and on the other side are, bare wires. Walksnail, I gave you this idea a year ago. I don't know how long. It was a long time ago. I said, why don't you ship your video transmitters with a plug that plugs into the plug that every flight controller has so people don't have to solder it up? It's a standard. DJI set the standard. Maybe that's why they don't want to do it. But HD0 VTXs come with a plug that will plug into this flight controller and you don't have to solder. DJI, same thing. Walksnail stubbornly gives you bare wires So you have to solder it or you have to make your own plug, and that's frickin' annoying. But setting that aside, here we can see that we've got ground, 10 volts, and here is TX and RX. That's our UART, and that is what we need to wire up this video transmitter. And I wanted to tell you all that because today I'm telling you how to wire up this video transmitter, but tomorrow you may need to figure out how to wire up another one, and I kind of want you to understand the concepts that we're working with here. This plug here, this is the plug that goes onto the flight controller where I showed you that plug that we were just looking at. And this plug here is the correct plug for a DJI video transmitter. The original V1 DJI Air unit has this plug. That doesn't exist anymore. What are you doing? So what you could do, I'm just whining today. What you could do is you could take this plug, which comes from Walksnail, and this plug, which comes from the flight controller, and you could solder all the wires together. But that's a pain in the ass. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm just going to direct solder the VTX to the flight controller. So we go back to the manual for the flight controller, and we see that on the top of the board, right about here, there also is ground, 10 volts, TX, and RX. Don't worry about the VTX. That's for the analog VTX. You don't care about that. Ground, 10 volt, TX, and RX. Those are the same things that were in the plug. And instead of plugging in, we're going to direct solder to them. And I'm going to be grumpy about it the whole dang time. So here's where on the flight controller those pads are. And actually, what I'm going to do is, you generally don't want wires running across the top of the flight controller. They kind of get in the way. What instead we're going to do is we're going to wire them coming off the flight controller this way, coming out the side, and we're going to fold them back underneath to the back. All right, I got a solder bridge here. If you get a solder bridge like that, an easy thing to do is just swipe with a dry iron. It'll lift the solder off and separate the pads. My soldering is sucking today. What is my problem? We're just going to kind of pull up on the flight controller a little bit. We're going to fish that. Actually, first, let's twist it. I always like to give all my wiring harnesses some twists. There's an argument that spiraling the wires helps keep electrical interference out, but that's not why I do it. I do it because it keeps the wires neat. You don't want to twist it so much that you put tension on your solder joints. The wires can break off. So we'll just give it just enough of a spiral that it kind of keeps itself together nice and neat instead of the wires all splaying out. And then we'll pass that underneath and pull it through towards the back of the quad. And again, we're not going to pull it so tight that it puts tension on the solder joints and breaks the wires. They will crack there. So we'll leave just a little slack there, but we'll pull that through. Next, we're going to take the video transmitter and the antenna, and we actually have to attach the antenna. I don't know why they don't do this from the factory, but they don't. So we're going to take these two screws. They're 1.5 millimeter screws. 1.5 millimeter driver. They're M2 screws, sorry. We're going to lift them out, and we're going to remove this retaining bar right here. This connector here is a UFL connector, and it's just going to go on there. You kind of just want to feel, you'll feel it kind of line up and seat into place, and then you just press down on it. And sometimes it helps to kind of rock it a little bit up and down just to get it to seat. But just apply some gentle pressure and rock it a little. Oh, no, didn't go. And when that's on, you can wiggle it this way, but if you apply a little upward pressure, it won't come off. I mean, if you apply enough upward pressure, it'll pop off. You'll kind of feel that seat into place, and it'll have a small amount of resistance to popping off. You know, if it just jumps right off, you didn't get it. And then we will install this retaining bar again. And we're going to need to just kind of wiggle that. So, yeah, perfect. Isn't that nice? There are nuts on the other side that these screws go into. Dang it. Did not realize that. Now, the video transmitter is going to mount in the back of the quad. The camera is going to mount in the front. And we've got this wire here. And again, I hate like just loose wires dangling about. So I want to pass that wire underneath the flight controller. But in order to do that, I'm going to have to disconnect the wire from the video transmitter. And I'm going to suggest that some of you may not want to do this because the connector is pretty fiddly. It's called a MIPI connector, M-I-P-I. And it's kind of fiddly. And it's like, you can do it, but some people may be like, I don't know, I don't want to like mess it up. I'm going to do it. So you remove those two screws, and then the MIPI connector is here, and this is super fragile, right? So I'm going to very carefully, I just like to pull up on the wire here, but I do it like I get as close to the connector as I can. There are these little tabs right here, and if you can get under those tabs, that works. But if you just apply a little upward pressure, like here with my finger, it'll just pop right off. And again, you see how tiny every bit of that is? It's kind of fragile. So don't apply excessive pressure. So then I'm going to pass this underneath the flight controller. Push the flight controller back down. Let's just take a look here and make sure we have good clearance. None of the wires are getting squished. It's a little difficult to get on camera, but none of the wires are getting squished or anything like that. They're all, but they're all sort of tucked in there. And then to reinstall the MIPI connector, we're going to, it's going to go like this. So silver side up, gold contacts down. And the key is to kind of get it lined up right before you push it down. And I actually like to come in very gently with a driver, because I kind of can't get my finger on it exactly right. And so I will Is it lined up right? It's a little bit off. There we go. See it now, it's perfectly aligned. And now if I just press down on it, click, it will seat into place. And I'm going to press down on both sides and make sure both sides are seated in, very carefully pressing only on the metal and only with just a little bit of pressure. And now it's fully seated. And then I can put that back on. And once you've done this, 5 times or 10 times, it's no big deal. But if it's your first time, you might be a little nervous. If you do this, and then when you power up your system, you have no video, you have no camera, like the video transmitter binds, and it's acting like everything's working, but there's black screen in your goggles, it's because that MIPI connector is not seated right. You got to open it back up again and take it off and just reseat it, basically. It will fix it. Like I said, you maybe just shouldn't do it, but I'm going to do it. The nuts are on the wrong side. It doesn't matter. I don't care. It so doesn't matter. I'm just going to run with it. Hey there, it's Joshua from the future, and I've discovered a problem with the way that Joshua in the past is telling you to mount the video transmitter. Take a look. The problem is that this wire sticks out, and that wire, it's fine right now, but if you were to crash and bend this prop, that wire will get nicked by the prop. And I tried all kinds of ways of like bending it down and tilting it up out of the way, and basically no matter what you do, it can get nicked by the prop. So what I'm going to have you do is this. I tried everything I could think of, and this is the only thing that I think is going to work. We're going to flip this over and mount it the other way around so that the cable is coming out the right side of the quadcopter. And then, well, if the cable runs like this, of course it can still get nicked. But if we just tuck the cable down and snug it up, if we take the slack out of there and kind of tuck that down against the bottom corner of the video transmitter, then you can see that no matter how that prop bends, it cannot hit the wire, and that's what we got to do. So leave this one vulnerable? No. I can't resist showing you the way that I would actually solve this problem. And I hesitate to do it because it requires some very difficult soldering. And if you try to follow along, you'll probably destroy your video transmitter. So I don't think you should try to do this. But I hate the fact that there's an elegant solution out there that I could show you, except it's kind of mean to show it to you and then to be like, yeah, but you're not a good enough solderer to do it. I don't know. Here's what it is. So the flight controller comes with this wire. It is a 6-pin JST housing. It had 5 wires in it. I've removed the outermost wire because it's not needed. And I have soldered that wire onto the solder pads on my video transmitter. And the reason it's fiddly soldering is that in order to make sure that they clear the props, you have to solder them coming like straight up off the pad, which is a little more difficult to do. And the soldering itself is fairly tight. Like getting in there, I bridged the pads with solder several times and had to clean them. But as you can see, in the end, this is a very nice way of doing it. The wires are out of the way, and now we have the ability to easily plug this into the flight controller. I'll show you where. So here is the USB port for reference. Here are the pads that eventually you're going to solder your flight controller or your video transmitter to, and this plug underneath those pads is where it would plug in. So I don't think you should try to do that. I think if you try to do that, you're going to destroy your video transmitter unless you have experience soldering better than it's your call though. And I want to, if you decide that you have got the chops to do it, that's the most elegant solution and the one I would actually go with, because now also it lets me plug in my video transmitter, and that's always nice. As far as mounting goes, the Walksnail video transmitter comes with this bag of hardware, and I'm going to guess that I'm going to hope that these screws maybe are the right size to mount it. You see, on the bottom of the video transmitter are these mounting lugs, and on the bottom of the flight controller are these holes, 1, 2, 3, 4, which are in a matching pattern to those mounting lugs. So I'm going to guess, I'm going to hope that if I just put this screw up through the bottom of that hole, how far in does it stick? I don't know if that's sticking too far up. I guess there's one way to find out. And I'm just going to loosely install that until I get all 4 of them in. Well, I guess I got to see if it's the right length. Okay, I'm going to put it the rest of the way in. Okay, we'll screw that all the way in. No, that's going to be perfect. Okay, so it bottomed out and it's snug. If it bottomed out before it got snug and it was just loose, then I'd need to figure something out. No, that's going to work fine. So the very shortest screws in the Walksnail kit, I don't even think they're 4 millimeters. They might be 4 millimeters. It might be a little less. Those are going to go at the bottom of the frame into the mounting lugs. Those mounting lugs are molded in, or milled, I don't know how they're made, but they if you over tighten these screws, they'll just strip right the heck out, and then you'll be double-sided taping this or something. So definitely, again, you could use blue Loctite if you want to use blue Loctite. It's a good idea. I'm not doing it, but mostly out of laziness. Or you just make sure you snug them in, but don't over snug them or you'll strip it. So definitely calibrate your torque sensor on in your hand. Now it's time to mount the camera, and the first thing I want to do is take a look at the hardware that's going to be used to mount the camera, because exactly how you do it's going to vary depending on which camera you're using. So first of all, we've got these camera plates, and they're going to go in the front of the quadcopter, and I want you to see that the camera plates are not symmetrical, okay? So they have a particular way that they go, and if you look at the front end of the frame, you'll see. So this is the camera plate, this is the top, and this is the bottom, okay? Right? And then if that goes here on the frame, you see that it kind of skews out just like the frame does, and the screw hole lines up, okay? So there's a left and a right camera plate, and there's a top and a bottom to the camera plate. So that's how that's going to go. So I'm going to go ahead and install the camera plates on the frame. I'm going to do that using these small M3 screws. Finally, we've got to that. They are just going to come up through the bottom of the bottom plate. The mount is going to go on, and it's going to screw right into that screw hole. And the little tab is going to go down into the hole. Did they make the tabs different sizes so you can't do it wrong? No, but they are. That's really clever, or lucky. The tabs are spaced differently, so if you get it wrong, you will not get very far. Wow, you can't do it wrong. That's got to be intentional. You can't put the camera plates on wrong. They won't line up until you've got them correct. That's really smart. So now that the camera plates are installed, we can proceed with mounting the camera. And in order to mount the camera, we're going to have to put one of these inserts into the camera plate. And I want you to see that there's a difference between these two inserts, even though they look the same. This mount here is not intended for the Walksnail camera. It is intended for analog cameras, and that's why this slot here, it's not spaced the same. The idea is that it'll give you a little front to back wiggle room for an analog camera. But this soft silicone mount here is not intended for the Walksnail camera. It is too soft and it will pull out. It's intended for the DJI O3. So there's two choices here. One, we're going to use this one, And we're just going to use one screw because this screw hole doesn't line up. And that means the camera will be a little bit less secure. It won't hold its angle as securely, but it'll still be okay. The other thing is that we're going to make a 3D printed version of this mount, which will fit the camera. There's a link to it in the video description below. And if you have a 3D printer, you can print yourself 2 of these in TPU, and then it'll be the right hardness and the right screw spacing. And that's actually what you should use. But in order to sort of, I'm not going to assume that everybody has a 3D printer. So I'm going to go ahead with these hard mounts and just use a single screw in this one screw hole. Hey there guys, it's Joshua from the future. I'm about to show you how to mount your camera in the frame. And what I want you to see is that if you mount your camera the normal way, this cable will tend to kind of hang out the bottom. And I don't like it. I'm worried it's going to get abraded when we land on it and eventually get damaged and not work. So what I want you to do is I want you to install this camera in the frame upside down with the cable coming out the top. That's not how Joshua in the past is going to do it, but that's how I want you to do it. And then what we're going to do is we're going to flip it over in software later. We can do that in the goggles, okay? This is how you're going to install your camera. Cable coming out the top, upside down. Okay, you got to really squeeze those guys in there. It seemed like they were fully inserted, but they were falling out. You see how it kind of sticks out the other side? Yeah, they got to really go in there. They're almost flush on the inside. Okay, so if you don't push them all the way in, you won't be able to get the camera in. Now, this camera has 2 holes, and this mounting bracket insert has 2 holes, and you see how that's going to go. And then also which way is up. I'm not 100% sure, but the lettering is this way up, so I think the wire's got to come out the bottom. So we're going to slide that in, and then we're going to just line that up with the 2 holes. The problem is that if I use too long of a screw to mount this camera, I'm going to screw it in, it's going to poke into the internals of the camera, and it's going to damage the camera. I need to make sure I mount this with the correct length of screw. This is one of the 8mm screws that came with the motors. I don't know, I'm just fishing around here. And that looks like it's going to be too long, but I'm not sure. So here's what I'm going to do. I want you to understand the process, although I'm just going to tell you the answer. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the camera, I'm going to line it up with that screw hole, with that screw. And I'm going to very carefully and very gently begin screwing it in. And if I feel any resistance whatsoever, I'm going to stop, because that means your screw is touching the inside of the camera and is about to damage something. No, I felt resistance. It's not screwed all the way in. That screw is too long. Great. That's how we know. And just to make sure the story is straight, these are the 6mm screws that came with the frame kit that were intended for use with the motors. These 6mm screws, of which there are 16 that come with the frame kit, or any 6mm M2 screw. That should be the same as the ones that came in the camera kit, I think, but I'm not 100% sure. The 6mm screws. And the result, at long last, you don't know how long I've been effing with this. The result will be something that looks like this. The camera is quite secure. The friction on the TPU is quite secure. I'm a little bit uncomfortable with how far the camera sticks out in front of the front end here. You ideally want the camera to be just flush, or maybe slightly behind the front of the cage to protect it from impacts. But if we were to move it back to these holes here, it would be too far back and you would see the camera cage, which you definitely don't want. So we're going to go with that. Like, it can't be perfect for every camera in the whole world. Oh yeah, that's quite secure. I don't even think you need to 3D print it. You don't even need the second screw. Like, that's requiring so much effort to move. I'm not promising it will never move, but it's pretty secure. And the first thing we're going to do is install the standoffs. We've got 2 screws sticking up here, and these standoffs are going to go on them. And I want you to see, as I screw this standoff down, how easy it would be to pinch these wires if these wires were sticking out and were to get under the standoff. It is a very, very common thing for people to do. They put their standoff on, they pinch one of the wires, and then when they plug in the battery, something short circuits or something doesn't work. So be really careful when you're putting your standoffs on that you're not pinching any of the wires. And then here on the back of the quadcopter, we've got these 2 holes. Those holes are each going to get an M3 by 4mm screw. One of these little teeny tiny M4 or M3 screws, and a standoff. And right now I'm just finger tightening these screws. I'm going to go over the whole quadcopter with a driver and cinch down the screws, but when I'm done with the whole build, that's just one of the last steps that I do. Frankly, it's a good idea to go over the quadcopter and cinch down the screws every little while. Maybe not every time you fly, but you fly, you crash, things vibrate, things loosen up, and they're less likely to loosen up if you use Loctite, which I'm not. But there you go. Now that we have got the standoffs installed, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to mount the video transmitter antenna. And if you're using Walksnail or DJI-03, you're going to use this 3D printed antenna mount that came with the kit. And it's basically just going to split open and then wrap around the shaft of the antenna like so. And then you'll see there is this little sort of ridge here, and that is for a zip tie. We're just going to take a zip tie and pass it around there and cinch it down, and that will help keep this from sliding out. If you really want to, you can get some adhesive. It needs to be a flexible adhesive. The one that I like the best is called E6000, and if you've ever used like shoe goo to fix your shoes, it dries kind of like that. It's a little flexible, a little kind of pliable and gooey, and it would be really good to put some E6000 on the inside here, and that would really hold this in place. But zip tie is going to be fine. We'll really cinch that down though, so it compresses that TPU, and yeah, that's pretty secure. This mount is going to go over these standoffs, but we can't just sort of slap it on there because we want to be aware of what's happening with this cable. And there are some ways that we could mount this where that cable would kind of be hanging out the back. We don't want that. We want the cable to be tucked up on the inside so it's nice and protected from damage. But we also need to be aware that it's really bad to kink these coaxial cables. This is the receiver antenna, but it's the same thing. We don't want any sharp kinks. It'll permanently damage the cable and you'll get terrible range. So we want to keep these bends as sort of gentle as possible. So what I'm going to do, I'm actually going to pass, can I pass that under? Will it fit? I don't know that it will. That's too bad. Okay. Yeah, I kind of don't like, I kind of want to, yeah. I'll tell you what, let's do this. I'm going to pop this up. I'm actually going to turn the receiver sideways. That'll reduce that bend. Let's stick that down. Yeah, so that's reduced that bend a little bit while still keeping the wire inside there. And this needs to go underneath. And the reason I want to do that is that the video transmitter, I'm going to kind of cock that over 45 degrees as much as I can, as much as it'll let me without stressing it. And I'm going to twist it into a circle like that on the inside and press it down over the top of the standoffs like so. And again, that's going to keep that tucked up inside and protected without putting unnecessary stress on it. And that's our goal. That is going to the inside of the standoffs. We never want to wrap a wire around the outside of the standoffs because that sets it up for being damaged. We want them inside and protected. And that's how that's going to be. Before we continue with the video, I'd like to remind you that the single best way for you to help make sure that I am able to continue making content like this, which hopefully you value, is to join my Patreon. Patreon is a website where you subscribe to me for as little as $2 a month. That's the minimum amount, just $2 a month. Someone's vacuuming. But join my Patreon, get access to my Discord server, and just feel good about supporting the work that I do here. If you watch my content regularly, then hopefully eventually you'll come to a point where you go, this guy's earned my support. If today is that day, join my Patreon at any level, at any dollar value that you pick. $2, pick $5, pick $10, pick whatever amount you think is fair for the amount of value you get out of my content. There's a link down below where you can click through. And if today's not the day, if you're like, I just want to watch the video, you've probably already skipped ahead. But yeah, keep watching the content. I'll keep making the content, and I hope that day comes. Next thing we need to do is update the firmware on the video transmitter and the goggles and configure the flight controller to work with the video transmitter. To update the firmware on the video transmitter, we're going to need this little USB adapter. The video transmitter doesn't have a full-size USB port on it. Kind of annoying, but I guess they're trying to keep it small and light. Depending on what video transmitter you have. You might get a plug kind of like this with just a USB port on it, or one like this, which looks the same but actually has a slightly different plug. Whatever plug you get is going to be compatible with whatever video transmitter you get, but confusingly, Walksnail uses different size plugs on different video transmitters, so don't just assume that this one that you got with your video transmitter is going to work with all the other Walksnail video transmitters. It's pretty frustrating, and I wish they would standardize on one plug size and one USB. I wish they'd put a freaking USB plug on their VTX, but especially on the little tiny micro ones for small quads, that's just not an option. Anyway, enough bitching. The USB adapter is going to plug into this plug on the side of the video transmitter. Be very careful when plugging it in. If you plug it in slightly crooked and try to jam it in with your finger, you can very easily damage it. So be careful, make sure it's lined up right, make sure it's the right side up, and then carefully plug it in. And I suppose we can go ahead and plug in USB, although nothing will happen until we plug a battery in. Next, I'm going to refer you to this site. Devil is a guy who maintains an archive of the Walksnail firmware, and I always go to his page to download them because I find it easier than the official Walksnail page. It's really easy to find older firmware versions and to keep track of the release notes, and it's just a nicer experience overall than going to Walksnail's page. What I'm going to recommend we do is download the latest release version. So this 38.43.12, you see how that's labeled as a beta? But 38.43.13 is listed as stable. That's the one we're going to download, or whatever the latest version is at the time that you're watching this. And then you're going to download two things. One is the VTX firmware, which is going to go on the video transmitter, and that's the same no matter which video transmitter you have, except for the Moonlight video transmitter, which we don't have in this build. And the other is going to be your goggles firmware, which is going to be for whichever goggles that you have, whether it's the Goggles X, that's what I have, the Goggles Lite, the Recon HD, or the original Fat Shark Dominator goggles. Whichever goggles you have, you're going to download the firmware for that. Next, we're going to get an SD card. I'm not sure if it needs to be formatted as FAT32 or whatever, but just to be safe, we're going to take that SD card, we're going to right-click and format it as FAT32. If it is larger than like 2 gig, you won't be able to use FAT32, and I suggest you get a smaller card. Sometimes devices have a hard time reading cards that are not formatted FAT32. Next, I'm going to take the avatar ground file for my goggles, whatever the file was that you downloaded for your goggles, and I'm going to drag that over to the SD card. We're going to take that SD card and we're going to insert it into our goggles. And we're going to power up our goggles. Now, while your goggles are powering up, take a look at the battery that you're using to power them and check to see if it is topped off. If the battery dies during the firmware update process, well, you won't brick your goggles. They fixed that issue. Yeah, see, my voltage is super low. My goggles are even warning me. They won't brick your goggles if you power off during the firmware update unless you have a super, super old firmware that you probably don't have, but it's still a good idea not to tempt fate. Once your goggles are fully powered up, you're going to hold down the bind button for about 7 to 10 seconds until the goggles begin beeping. Okay. At this point, you should see the splash screen inside the goggles says Avatar HD System, and then the goggles will begin beeping. If the goggles begin beeping like this, beep, beep, a slow beep, that means the firmware update is in process. You just wait. It may take as much as 5 or 10 minutes for it to finish. Just wait it out. If the goggles start beeping fast, like beep, 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 it means that something is wrong. They can't read the SD card. You've put the wrong file on the SD card or something like that. It means the firmware update is not proceeding and you need to power the goggles off and figure out why they're not updating. Okay, well, while that's going on, we'll go ahead and do the video transmitter. The way we're going to do that is we're going to power up the quadcopter, and we should see the LED on the video transmitter come on, and we should see a new USB drive pop up on our computer. Okay, so blinking LED on the video transmitter, and new USB drive appeared on our computer. That USB drive is the USB of the video transmitter, and we're going to take the Sky file and we're going to drop it on that USB drive to copy it over to the video transmitter. Then we're going to hold the button down on the video transmitter for about 7 seconds until the LED goes off and the USB drive disappears. The update of the video transmitter only takes a few seconds. I have no idea why it's so fast and the goggles are so slow, but it is. And as soon as the light comes back on, we will be done. Okay. I'm going to unplug the video transmitter now that the light has come back on. It's just solid red. I'm going to unplug it so it doesn't get too hot. And when my goggles have finished updating, we'll go ahead and bind them. Oh, there it is. That's the sound that means the firmware update is done. It goes beep, and then it should be rebooting. It is, it's rebooting. Now we're going to bind the goggles to the video transmitter. It's really simple. On the goggles, we're just going to press the bind button once. They will begin beeping. We're going to power up the video transmitter by plugging in a battery. When the LED on the video transmitter comes on and begins blinking like this, we're going to press the bind button one time. The LED will go solid red. I said the LED will go solid red, but there's one other problem we've run into, actually. And the problem is that clearly the goggles are bound and everything's working, but we have no image. Oh no. I was about to say, is my camera disconnected? Wait, no, I have my lens cap on. Hold on. Oh, everything is fine. I was about to think I messed up the plugging the camera into the video transmitter. No, I just had the lens cap on. Yay! The next thing I want you to see is, do you see in the lower right-hand corner, it says 10 volts and it's red. What that's telling us is that the voltage that the video transmitter is getting is too low. But hang on, no, it's not. I told you earlier that the acceptable voltage range for the Walksnail video transmitter is 7 to 26 volts. 10 volts is well within that range, so why is it red? That is actually the voltage that it thinks the quadcopter is at. And if this was a quadcopter battery, 10 volts might be too low. So when you see that red 10.1 volts down there in the lower left, just ignore it. It doesn't mean anything. Next, we're going to set up the flight controller to work with the on-screen display in the goggles, but I can't help but notice that my video transmitter is overheating. So I'm going to get this little USB-powered fan, and it's going to blow on the video transmitter and cool it down. I apologize for the small amount of sound that's going to make, but we're going to need to do that to keep the video transmitter from overheating. I want you to take a look at this right here. Do you see the no SD card, 14.6 gig? Down here at the bottom, channel 6. These OSD elements here are part of the Walksnail system, and the Walksnail goggles are drawing them and telling you about the Walksnail system, like how much space there is on the SD card in the goggles. These OSD elements here, like RSSI, DBM, and so forth, that is actually coming from the flight controller. And you probably don't have those, because the only reason these are here is because I used the same flight controller to set up the DJI video transmitter for the previous video. So hold on. I just didn't want them to disappear suddenly without you knowing why. But what you should see is actually this. No on-screen display coming from the flight controller. And we totally want an on-screen display from the flight controller. Imagine like that you had a car, but like the odometer and the gas gauge didn't work. And that's a very rough explanation for why you absolutely want the on-screen display. The information it gives you is essential. In order to do that, we are going to need to configure the flight controller to communicate certain information to the video transmitter. And in order to do that, we are going to need Betaflight Configurator. So Betaflight is the firmware that runs on the flight controller, and Betaflight Configurator is what we use to configure the flight controller. If at this point you have previously downloaded and installed Betaflight Configurator, good. If not, this is going to be one of the things that I'm going to actually refer you to another video on, because I have another video that perfectly explains how to get Betaflight downloaded and installed, and I kind of don't want to put that stuff, just reproduce that content in this video. So if you've never downloaded and installed Betaflight Configurator, pause the video here, go down to the link in the video description, get Betaflight installed, get your drivers sorted out, anything you need to do based on that video, and then come on back here and we will pick up where we left off. Okay, so now you've got Betaflight Configurator installed. We're going to plug USB into the flight controller And when we do that, I want you to take a look up here in the upper right of the configurator. When I do that, a serial port will appear. See, COM3 appeared. That's the one we're going to select, and we're going to hit connect, and we're going to connect to the flight controller. It's going to give us some error messages. Don't worry, we'll fix those later. For now, we're just going to close that. And what we need to do is we need to go to the presets tab, and there's just a preset you can load that does all the configuration for the video transmitter without us having to do each of the individual steps. And the preset we're looking for is avatar. Start typing the word avatar in this search box and you will find OSD for FPV WTF DJI-03 Avatar HD. That's the one you want. So we're going to go ahead and click that, and then we want to open up these options, and we want to make sure that the map to DisplayPort and set HD OSD options are on. Just take my word for that now, we want that. And then we also need to tell the flight controller what UART number we put the video transmitter on. Do you remember that we soldered the gray and the white wire to TX1 and RX1? That's UART1. So we're going to select UART1 here. We're going to hit pick, and then we're going to hit save and reboot. Having done that, we can go to the OSD tab. And what I want you to do is just pick an OSD element like battery voltage. And I'm going to click this leftmost tick box, and battery voltage will appear on screen. And then, if we go over to our goggles, we should see battery voltage on screen. And if I drag that to a new location on screen, like let's just put that all the way in the upper left-hand corner, we should see that it goes to the upper left-hand corner in our goggles. Except it didn't, did it? That 22.2 volts that you see up there is not in the upper left-hand-most corner of our goggle screen. It is sort of in the middle of the screen. Here's the reason for that. What we need to do is go into the goggle menu and choose Settings, Display, and then OSD Position. And what I want you to do is use the joystick to move this red box up and left all the way until it is all the way in the upper left-hand corner of the screen. Great, but there's another problem we're going to solve. Watch. If I move this all the way down to the lower right-hand corner of the screen, can you guess whether it's going to be in the lower right-hand corner of our goggles? Oh, you win $1 million. It's not. Here's how we fix that. What we're going to do is, first of all, hit save, just to save our OSD layout. We'll come back to this. We're going to go to the CLI tab. We're going to click in the text box right here, and I'm going to paste in these lines and hit enter. And you can find these lines down in the video description below, so you don't have to try to type them in manually. Just copy paste them from the video description. Your screen should look like this. Then I'm going to go down to the text box and type the word save. And then if I reconnect and go back to the OSD tab, what you should see is that now the layout of the OSD tab, the sort of size and shape, actually matches what my goggles have. So if you take a look at where the voltage is here in the OSD tab, that actually corresponds with where the voltage is in the actual camera. So now, if we drag this all the way to the lower right-hand corner, it appears all the way in the lower right-hand corner. Actually, well, we kind of may not want that because it overlaps with the channel readout, so maybe I'll just move this up a couple of clicks. And then let's see how that looks. Oh, that looks really good. Okay. Now, you can, at this point, tweak your OSD all you want and drag things wherever you want them and play with that. That's something you can do on your own time. But I'm going to give you my preferred OSD setup. I've got all of this stuff, and I'm going to put it down in the video description below, and I'm going to copy it. You could copy it from the video description. I'm going to go to Betaflight Configurator, go to the CLI tab, and paste it in. And hit enter, and type the word save. And now, this is what the OSD looks like in Betaflight Configurator, and this is what it looks like in the Walksnail system, and this is actually what I use as my personal OSD. You can copy it, you could not, it's up to you. Whatever you do though, absolutely you need battery voltage turned on at the very least so you can monitor your battery voltage. We'll talk more about that. Well, that might even be just a topic for a whole nother video series, but you definitely, it'll be like driving without your gas gauge. You won't know when your tank's about to be empty. And unlike your gas tank, when you run a battery empty, you destroy it. Well, your gas tank, you're sad because you got to go get some gas, but at least you put the gas back in the car and everything's fine. There's one more thing that I just remembered that you need to do, and I forgot about it because you only ever need to do it once, and I did it a long time ago. But if you have got your goggles for the very first time, they're brand new, then when you go into the channel, for example, do you see 7 channels and then a CHP, a public channel, or do you only see 3 channels there? If you go to settings and go down to bitrate, do you have the option to select high bitrate as well as standard, or do you only have standard? If you don't have those options, then it means you need to unlock your goggles. Here's how you do it. First, you're going to need to go to this Google Drive link, which I will put down in the video description below, and download this zip file. Then you're going to take the avatar_PWR and avatar_STD file, and you're going to copy them to your goggles SD card. After that, you're going to put the SD card back in the goggles and power cycle the goggles. And when you do that, you should have access to all 8 channels. You should have high bitrate mode available, and you should have access to power levels 1000 and 1200 milliwatts. And that will confirm that the goggles are fully unlocked and enabled. Next, I'm going to show you a few settings that you need to change in your Walksnail system to get the best performance out of it. First, I want you to go into the Walksnail menu, go to settings, and I want to show you the transmit power. Obviously, the higher the transmit power, the more range you're going to get out of the system. 25 milliwatts I'm using here on the bench because I don't want my video transmitter to overheat, but if I were flying in real life, I would turn that up. Now, you'll notice that that goes all the way up to 1200 milliwatts. In the past, Walksnail video transmitters haven't given much increased range past about 700 milliwatts. In fact, if you look at Chris Rosser's output power testing, some of the video transmitters, they hit 500 milliwatts, and then when you set it to 700, 1000, or 1200, you don't actually get more output power. In other cases, you do get more output power, but it seems like the signal is like dirtier in some way, like the latency becomes really unpredictable, the bit rate becomes unpredictable, and it's a worse experience overall. So I would say set this to 500, maybe try it at 700, maybe try it at 1000 and 1200 and see what your experience is, but don't assume that you're going to get the best results at 1200. The other thing to keep in mind is if you're flying with other pilots, it makes sense to keep this as low as possible to avoid interfering with other pilots. And you should know, as being a good Walksnail citizen of the FPV world, that these goggles are transmitting the whole time that they are powered up. Whether your drone is powered up or not, if you have these goggles turned on, they're blasting away, and if you go walk up next to somebody who's flying, you'll interfere with them and potentially make them lose video. So power your goggles down when you're not using them, and don't walk around other pilots with them powered up, whatever your output power is. Next, resolution. And you'll see that my resolution is set to 720p, although I do have the option to set it to 1080p as well. In my experience, Walksnail needs all the help it can get. Setting it to 1080p actually doesn't give a better looking image. There are more pixels, but because of the bit rate and the image compression, it actually kind of looks worse. Again, this is something that you can test for yourself and see what you think. But personally, I run 720p on all my Walksnail systems. I think that gives the best range, the most consistent image, and I would only use 1080p. Well, I really just wouldn't. For bitrate, we have the option of high or normal. What you need to know about this is that when you're flying by yourself, always use high bitrate. When you use high bitrate, you will take up more frequency space, and you'll see that there's only 3 channels available instead of 8 channels. Well, 3 channels plus the public channel, or on normal bitrate, there's 7 channels plus the public channel. That's because the channels get wider, and what you need to know about that again is that if you're flying with other people, it is courteous to set yourself to normal bitrate so you take up less space and you leave more room for the other pilots who are flying at the same time as you. But if you're flying by yourself, always have that set to high. It'll give you the best image quality. Frame rate, we have the choice of standard or high, and standard is 60 frames per second, high is 100 frames per second. If I set that to high, my screen that I'm showing you this on will glitch out because it doesn't support 100 frames per second. And that's actually a note about frame rate. If you're trying to use the HDMI out on your goggles to play into a monitor, many monitors can only support a 60 FPS feed, and you'll need to set it to normal for our standard frame rate. If you've got a gaming monitor or something else that has supports like 240 frames per second, sometimes it still won't work. even if it supports 240 FPS, 4K resolution, it might not support 720p 100, which is kind of an oddball resolution. So you might always want to set that to standard if you're doing HDMI out. For normal flying though, I would always have this set to high frame rate because it gives lower latency. Now, do you see at the bottom of the screen here, it says choose a channel? That's because right now we are on the public channel, and it's very important that you do not fly your drone on the public channel. The public channel is where the video transmitter and the goggles go to meet up before they then go to their final destination, the channel that they're actually on when they fly. And you will, number one, not get full output power or full range on the public channel. And number two, anybody else who powers up their Walksnail system is also going to end up on the public channel and stomp on you. So what we need to do is go to channel, and you'll see here that we have 3 channels and the public channel available. We're going to want to select one of those channels before we go fly. And I always choose channel 3, and the reason for that is that channel 3 is outside the range of frequencies used by Wi-Fi networks. Actually, if you're in high bitrate mode, it's not entirely outside the range, but it's the channel that is least likely to get interfered with by Wi-Fi networks. However, you can see here, the green bars here indicate how clean the channel is. If you see orange or black bars here, it means something else is on that channel, whether it's an analog pilot, a DJI pilot, a Wi-Fi network, and you would want to try to avoid that channel. There's one more setting that we're going to look at, and it is the camera rotation setting. And the reason we need to look at it is we've got this problem where the camera cable is hanging out the bottom of the frame. And I'll show you that in a second when I clear the bench of this screen, but I want to show you where this option is. If I go Settings, Camera, there is the Rotate option, and I'm going to set that to Rotate 180 degrees, and that will flip the camera upside down. In this video, we installed the Walksnail video transmitter and camera in the frame. We connected them to the flight controller. We bound and updated the firmware on the Walksnail system, and we set up the on-screen display so that we have full functionality of that with the flight controller. That's going to do it for this video. I will see you in the next one, where we will, I think we're going to set the receiver up next. Oof. I'll see you there. Playlist down in the video description. Card on screen if you can see cards on your platform that you're watching on now. I'll see you there.